first Taiwan Colloquium of the summer term 2021, and to host Taiwan Colloquium in general for the first time. I am Beatrice, and I'm very happy to have Dr. Dafydd here today for his book launch, actually. And so just a couple of words about Dafydd. So Dafydd is interested in Taiwanese politics since a very long time, since he was actually a language student in Taipei in 1980s. He got a degree in Chinese studies, and he spent most of the 90s working in Taiwan in the education, broadcasting, tourism, and sport management sectors. He joined SOAS politics department as a PhD student in 1999, and he has been teaching there since 2003, where he's actually reader at the moment. Dr. Fell's main research focus has been on Taiwanese political parties and electoral politics. His first book, he just mentioned before, Party Politics in Taiwan, from 2005, examined party change in the first 15 years of multi-party politics. He has published numerous journal articles and book chapters on Taiwan's party system, new parties, and how parties learn from electoral setbacks. And he has been publishing extensively on the topic. He has been working over the last few years on a project on the politics of migration, and he has also co-edited a volume titled Migration to and from Taiwan. And he has also more recently shifted his attention towards Taiwan's social movements, publishing as well an edited book titled Taiwan Social Movement under Ma Ying-jeou in 2017. And his current research projects include looking at Taiwan's Green Party, party switching, and candidate selection with parties. Dafydd, we are very happy to welcome you. He has been very active in developing the field of Taiwan studies at SOAS and abundantly and largely beyond. He has also been helping establishing the European Association of Taiwan Studies in 2004, and he has been the Association Secretary General for 8 years. And in SOAS, we have to say that he has developed the world's most expensive Taiwan studies teaching and academic events projects. And today's presentation will be the book launch of his most recent publication, Taiwan's Green Parties, Alternative Politics in Taiwan, published by Routledge. And I think that Dafydd, the floor or the screen is for you now, and thank you very much for being here. We are very happy.
Fantastic, thanks for that, Beatrice. And also thanks, Stefan and Gunther, for the invitation to come back to Tübingen. I should also say that this is a delayed visit. I was originally due to come to Tübingen, I think it was in late January 2020, and then we delayed it to May 2020. So I think actually, if I remember correctly, the book I was due to present on, I think was this one, Taiwan Studies Revisited. But because of delay, another one has come out. So I'm really happy to be back in Tübingen, even if it's on an online basis, and look forward to actually coming back in person as soon as possible. So for today's talk, I'm going to be talking about this new book that came out in March of this year, Taiwan's Green Parties. In many ways, this book is my second PhD style book. I think one of the most challenging task for an academic is coming out of the shadow of their first book that is based on their PhD. And one of the things I will try to do a little bit is talk about some of the practical sides of putting this book together. Now, one of the reasons why it's so difficult to do the second PhD style book is because once you get into regular academic life, it's easy to be so overwhelmed by the demands of teaching, administration, and finding time for research. So it's a very different environment compared to the PhD, when you tend to be much more singularly focused on a single project. And in fact, not long after I finished my PhD, I did try to put together a second PhD style book. But after about 5 years, I ended up giving up and moving on to a more kind of general teaching focused book. But finally, this book came out after something almost like 8 years of research. So what I'm going to try and do today is talk a little bit about the process, about how I started getting involved in this project, which is very, very different from my first book. I'll talk about the research questions that drive the project, but also talk about the practical sides, the kind of research material I was using, and the kind of research methods that I was using to put together this project. As is generally the practice with book launches, I won't go into a huge amount of detail of the contents of the book, but I'll talk briefly about what I try to cover in each of the main empirical chapters. And then I'll talk a little bit about what I'm trying to do next. In other words, as far as I'm concerned, the project isn't over yet. It's still a developing project. And I think that's one of the reasons why I still feel so excited about this project, even though the formal book is now out. So how did I first become interested in Taiwan's small parties? Well, it's quite a long story, and I think in Beatrice's introduction, she touched upon that early visit that I made to Taiwan as a language student back in 1989, 1990. And that was quite an interesting time when it comes to Taiwan's party system, because we were starting to get formal legalized political parties contesting elections. And at this time, in addition to the DVP challenging the KMT, we also saw the emergence of a large number of small political parties, many of these leftist parties. And this started to capture my interest in small parties, even though ultimately they were not successful. But I was interested in this idea of an alternative to the mainstream political parties. When I came to writing my my PhD and the book that came out of my PhD, I looked at, again, as Beatrice mentioned, I looked at the party change for the three main political parties in the period between 1991 and 2004. And although most of the analysis in the book looks at the two dominant parties, the DVP and the KMT, my third party case was the new party. And what I found really interesting was the fact that the way to explain new party behavior was quite different from that of the two mainstream political parties. In other words, my framework of analysis didn't work so well for a very ideological political party, which was the new party. And that's led me to start writing my first articles about small parties in Taiwan, which came out in September of 2005. And in that article in China and International Journal, I looked at the overall development of small parties in Taiwan. Most of the focus was naturally on splinter parties, such as the new party, that split away from the two mainstream parties. But I did give a little bit of attention to movement parties. And when I went back to look at that article again, after quite a long time of not looking at it, I did discover that in the article, I had a couple of very short paragraphs on the Taiwan Green Party, on its establishment and first couple of elections. But still, that wasn't enough to push me to actually write a whole book on what seemed to be almost like a footnote in Taiwan's party system. The key moment that kind of led me into this direction was an email from one of my students, Yuanru, who had studied at my university in the anthropology department. And just a few months after she graduated, she stood for election as a Green Party candidate. And for me, that was really quite eye-opening to see how someone could basically go from writing their dissertation, not being fully graduated, and then just going to stand for a national election, particularly when generally it takes a lot of preparation, both financial and time-wise, to actually win election in Taiwan. So that kind of, there was that connection. And then she later went on to become the co-convener of the Taiwan Green Party and asked me if I was interested in getting involved in doing some limited research on the party. So together with a Taiwanese academic, we put together a proposal to organize some focus groups on the evolution of the party, thinking that it might lead to something, but without a kind of a clear direction. And this is my first kind of Green Party's research photograph from December of 2012, the first time we ran a couple of focus groups on the party. Although the picture here is looking quite cheerful, what really kind of struck me was just how passionate, idealistic, and angry particularly one of these focus groups was. And I found the discussion was so different from that I'd seen when I'd been looking at mainstream political parties. So after these 2 days of very intense focus groups, I was really hooked on the subject and began what would become 7 years of research with frequent trips to Taiwan. So that's the kind of the personal side, how I became interested in this topic. But of course, we also need to think about academic justifications. Why write a whole book on Taiwan's Green Party? And in fact, this was one of the initial challenges that I faced with this project when I first started writing journal articles. For the first time in my career, I was submitting articles to journals, but being rejected on the grounds that this topic wasn't important enough, rather than because of the quality of the academic work. So it took me a while to get the first journal articles on the Taiwan Green Party published, because journals raise question marks about the importance of this topic. However, there is a pretty significant international literature on green parties. And one of the things that I try to do in this book is to engage with the global green literature, but also the literature on small and movement political parties. In fact, if we think comparatively, Taiwan's Green Party took a much shorter time to get into Taiwan's parliament than the Green Party of England and Wales, which took a number of decades to get into parliament. While interestingly, in the Taiwan case, it enters the National Assembly only less than 2 months after the party's formation. And what I try to do in this book is offer a quite alternative perspective on the evolution both of Taiwan's civil society and the party system from the mid-1990s through to 2020. So anyone that's familiar with both Taiwan's civil society and party system will be quite familiar with a lot of the things I'm talking about in terms of social movements and also elections. But the angle is very, very different. And that's that focus on an environmental political party. Next, let me come then to the questions that really drive this project. And I think the key thing I need to mention about these questions is that what I'm trying to do in each of these questions is to link the Taiwan case to broader literature debates have to do as Taiwan studies scholars. And that's to engage with readerships beyond Taiwan specialists. And through each of these questions, that's something that I'm trying to do. The research questions are a little bit more ambitious than for my first book. Here I have how, who, so what, and why questions. But I have more questions than we normally do in a PhD style book. The how question particularly focuses on the question of party change. How has the party changed over time in terms of its organization, but also in terms of the issues that it prioritizes? The who question looks at who have led the party, who have represented the party, and who have supported the party. So again, here we can make comparisons between the kind of candidates that we've seen in the Taiwan party, or the type of people that have supported the Taiwan Green Party with those of international Green parties. In other words, does the demographic base of the party look similar to its international counterparts? Then we come to the so what question. And here I look at the question of the party's electoral performance over the first 24 years, but also its international engagement. For example, the party has engaged with the global Greens networks. And then the area that I devote the most time to is the other why questions. For example, how to explain the formation of the party in 1996, but also the formation of the splinter party. So here we're engaging with theories of movement party formation. The second why question is to explain the first how question. In other words, how to explain party change. So for example, do the kind of key variables that we see in terms of explaining party change, such as electoral performance, inner party balance of power, do they work for a movement party? And the third why question looks at the performance of the party. How do we explain the variation in the party's performance over the years? Because there's a lot of fluctuation in the party's performance, both over time, but between different candidates. Now, one challenge, of course, that we often face with this kind of political party is that it's not a particularly successful party. Maybe the book would sell better if the party was more successful. But then again, I think that it's often fascinating to explain failure. It's often as interesting as success. If we think, for example, about the British Labour Party in 1979 or 1983, a huge amount has been written on these electoral defeats. So similarly, I think we can, there's much we can talk about. And one of the key arguments that I make in the book is the idea that the party's electoral setbacks were never inevitable. If different strategies had been adopted, probably the performance could have been much better. Okay, so what I'll do next then is talk through some of the research methods that I've used to create this book. Firstly, this was the first time that I've relied heavily on focus groups. So this was quite different from my first book, which was very, very focused on individual interviews. And this, for me, was, again, really fascinating, doing focus groups both with party leaders and activists, as we see on the picture on the left, but also for party members, which was something that I hadn't tried before. So again, I was trying to bring in very, very different perspectives. The second big resource for the book was interviews, interviewing party figures, activists, and leaders. But again, the approach was quite different because I was interviewing over a much longer time period. For the PhD, I just interviewed over a single 3-month period and only interviewed once. But in this case, for many of my respondents, I was interviewing them multiple times over 7 years. So bringing, again, a quite different perspective. And it was only in the final stage of the research that I did some online interviews, particularly for the 2020 election. I also did supporter interviews for this project. So in other words, people who had stated they'd voted green in the past. And we also, together with my Taiwanese co-author, we also did supporter online surveys. So you can see how the type of methods was much more diverse than in my first book. But I did have a degree of content analysis that overlaps with the first book. For example, I made much more use of election gazettes, which are the big sheet of paper that is given to voters for each election, where we can see things like the candidate's age, birthplace, education background, experience, and policy proposal. So this is the Green Party's election gazette listing for the 2020 election. But I also made use of things like the Central Election Commission database and media sources, for example, the United Daily News database. I also bring in types of resources that weren't available when I did my first book. For example, websites were much more important. Social media, Facebook particularly was very useful. And also candidate blogs were really, really useful. And of course, audiovisual material. YouTube now generates a huge amount of data. And the picture we have here is from a candidate's blog, from Panachan's blog. I also did political advertising analysis, which was perhaps one of the key resources for my first book. But the difference here was that the party basically never buys newspaper ads, which was a key resource for a lot of my earlier research. So that meant looking at things like posters, such as we see on the left, but also YouTube election ads. And unlike the TV ads that we tend to associate with Taiwanese election campaigns, these ads that weren't generally placed on paid TV channels. These were ads that were placed on YouTube, on social media. But again, this really brings a kind of a rich picture of the issue appeals that have been used in the election campaigns. And we can see here with the focus on same-sex marriage about the way that the party has quite diverse issue appeals. What about the writing then? So it took me a long time to actually get writing this book. If you consider that I started the research in December of 2012, and although I published a couple of journal pieces in 2016 and 2017, the writing didn't actually start until November of 2019. So it took me a long time to work out how to structure the analysis. But once I did have the framework and structure, then the writing was, again, much more smooth than it had been for my PhD, which was a very kind of quite a struggle. I was fortunate to get a term of research leave, and that gave me a little bit of space. But essentially, the bulk of the book was written in November 2019 to January 2020, another block in March, and then after the reviews came back in the summer of 2020, I had another couple of chapters to write. But I think for me, it kind of reinforced the importance of having some space away from teaching, but also the importance of having a very, very solid framework to actually deal with the material. And I think that that helped a lot, but it just took me a long time to work out the exact framework of analysis. Okay, now what I'm going to do then next is just to talk through some of the kind of the key things that I look at in the core empirical chapters. I'm not going to touch upon chapter 2, which is the literary review and frameworks chapter, and then try to kind of link these back to those research questions. So the So for chapter 3, I look at formation of Taiwan's Green Parties. And here I need to point out why I called the book Taiwan's Green Parties and not the Green Party Taiwan. So it's plural. And that's because even though the main focus is on the Green Party Taiwan, I do look at 2 other parties, the Trees Party, which is a Green Party splinter party, and I also look at a failed attempt to create an earlier Green Party in 1995. So here the question that I'm dealing with is what explains party formation, but also what explains party splits. That's the focus on the second case in 2014. So for example, I talk about the way that social movements and civil society were becoming increasingly distrustful of the DPP. And that partly explains why the party was established in 1996. However, the party struggles to kind of fully break away from the DPP. And this is one of the constant struggles that features in the book, that love-hate relationship between the environmental movement and the DPP. Okay, so that's the chapter 3. Then in chapter 4, I look at the impact of the party, looking at the electoral performance. For example, the first case of electoral success in 1996 that we see in the picture on the left. And this chapter has some quite technical details. For example, looking at the electoral system, looking at the campaigns on a district level as well as on the national level, and we can see those kind of fluctuating performances over the years, and this gives me the information that I need to explain the why. So I have some puzzles to explain. In other words, for example, why do we see one candidate doing especially well in, for example, 1998, but others do quite poorly? But I also look at the party's international engagement. And I think this is one of the things that makes the Green Party particularly interesting. In many ways, the Green Party is the most international party in Taiwan because of its international green diplomacy. And this starts from very, very early on in the party's history, when, for example, in the party's first campaign in 1996, we have a visit from a English Green Party representative during that first campaign, offering advice about what it means to be an international Green Party. And one of the things that came through in the interviews for the book was that a lot of the Green Party figures found the international engagement the most rewarding element of being a member of the Green Party. And of course, this is an area where Taiwan has an advantage internationally over China. In other words, Taiwan can be a full member of the Global Greens network. And it does play a key role in the creation of the Asia-Pacific Green Party's network. And what we have here is a Green Party delegation coming to my university after attending the Global Greens conference in Liverpool in 2017. And in fact, at that point in time, were actually 2 Taiwanese parties that were members of the Global Greens. So in the morning, the Green Party spoke at SOAS, and in the afternoon, it was the Trees party. In chapter 5, I look at the who question. And here I look at the party figures. So I look at this statistically in terms of the background of party figures, to what extent they were, for example, social movement figures, and to what extent were they mainly from the environmental movement. And just from this picture here, we can get a sense of who were the Green Party. So here we have a press conference from 1998, where we see the party founder, Gao Zhengyan. But we also see the international pitch side of the party. We have Linda Arrigo, who many of you will know as a key figure in the Taiwan studies field. And she was the party's international officer in the party's early years. But we can also get a sense of the international engagement, as here we have a representative from the European Greens, Franz Floss, an Austrian Green in Taiwan in 1998. But we also get the sense that the party is also a younger party than most other Taiwanese parties. So we tend to see much younger candidates, and we also tend to see much better gender balance in the party's candidates. The Green Party is the first party to have a female leader, which we see here on the far right. The party will also be the first party to nominate openly LGBT candidates in 2010, and the first party to have a LGBT co-convener in 2016. But I also look at the kind of background of party supporters, and here again we see a lot of similarities to what we would expect internationally. In other words, party supporters tend to be younger, urban residents, highly educated, have experience of involvement in protest, and tend to be much more liberal in their attitudes on issues such as gender. However, we also see the importance of environmental issues, particularly anti-nuclear activism, but also more general day-to-day environmental concerns. So again, we can see how the party does fit that kind of international profile. Okay, what I do then next is to look at the party's development chronologically through a number of chapters. So this next chapter looks at the party's first election in 1996. And I kind of set a precedent of looking at the how question, in other words, looking at the campaign messages, looking at how we explain variation in campaign performance. So why do some candidates do especially well and others less so? And here we have a picture from one of the key campaign moments in 1996, where the party founder goes out into the Chinese missile zone. So we've got to remember that this first campaign is taking place at the same time as the first presidential election in March 1996, in the background of the cross-strait missile crisis. And here we can see how the party is not just talking about environmental issues. It does talk about anti-nuclear in this campaign, but it's trying to show that it is tough on China. So it's trying to engage with that kind of cross-strait relations, national identity, a debate that's so central to many Taiwanese election campaigns. The next chapter then moves on to the 1998 local elections. And here, one of the big puzzles that I look at is, even though there's about, I think, 9 or 10 candidates, why was one so successful or so close to getting elected? And that's Peng Yanwen, who will go on to be my co-author later on, and my kind of key kind of research partner for the early part of this this project. So I'm able to kind of bring out my kind of key explanatory framework, which focuses on 2 dimensions to explain party formation. And that's looking firstly at the state of the party system. In other words, the strategies of the mainstream parties, but also the competition of competing smaller parties. So for example, in 1996, the Green Party was the only alternative party to those 3 core parties. But in 1998, the field was more competitive, as a number of other splinter parties that had split away from the DPP competed with the Green Party. And this did have an impact on performance. However, as I do in most of the chapters, I particularly focus on the Green Party's, the quality of the Green Party's own campaign, and its ability to get a balance between idealism and winning votes. And we see in this chapter what was special about Peng's campaign, through her campaign team, ability to get mainstream media attention, and some of the campaign styles that are adopted. The next chapter is a rather different chapter because it looks less at elections. I call this the quiet period of the Green Party, when the party almost drops out of contesting elections. The campaigns are really marginal, the token candidates. So instead, I focus mainly on two questions. One is, why does the party collapse after 1998? And secondly, how does the party rebuild from 2015? So this chapter is a little bit different, but I quite enjoy looking at both the decline and then the rebuilding of the party. Generally, what happens in Taiwan is when a small party has a disaster, they often will cease competing in elections. We saw this with many of the leftist parties. But I think what makes the Green Party interesting is that it keeps recovering after setbacks and finds new ways to rebuild and rebrand. In the next chapter, I look at the party's return to election and the attempt to rebuild and become competitive. And I look at one round of local elections, a by-election in 2009, and national elections. So we see a number of different approaches. For example, working together with a Labour group, so-called Red-Green Alliance in 2008. Working together with social movement activists, particularly environmentalists, in 2006. However, one of the things we find in this initial recovery period is, despite having strong candidates, getting mainstream media attention, that the party struggled to repeat its electoral performance of the 1990s period. So again, I focus most on trying to explain the limited impact in this return to elections period. And again, we do get variation in terms of the quality of campaigns and the impact of these campaigns. So, for example, here we have a image for a treetop protest. It did get a lot of media attention, a little bit like the case in 1998, but it only translated into something like 1,000 votes. So it really was a setback. But the party does try to kind of build on that initial new foundation and try to become a relevant party with organizational reforms. And here I look at the 2010 and 2012 campaign. And we can see a number of changes here. For example, being nominated at the national level in 2012. He'd been nominated at the local level in 2010. And the party started to be a little bit more competitive. It's still just about approaching the levels that it gained in 1996 and 1998. And again, I'm looking at the quality of the campaigns, but also the struggle it faces in terms of alliances. For example, a lot of this chapter focuses on the Pan Han Sheng campaign, where he works in alliance, in an unofficial alliance with the DPP. And we see how controversial that alliance was, and how this was one of the reasons why my initial focus groups in late 2012 were just so angry. But in 2012, the party managed to get 1.7% of the national vote, which was a pretty impressive figure, considering how disorganized the party actually was in that campaign. However, at this point in time, it's something that will change quite soon. But it's still quite a competitive picture in terms of splinter parties. So again, I'm looking at a combination of the party system, but also the balancing between vote maximizing and the party idealism. we get our next round of organizational reforms in 2013, 2014, when the party again contests local elections. And here we have a poster from the 2014 campaign. So the party was much better funded by this stage. It has tight connections with a number of environmental organizations, and it does finally win local seats in the November of 2014. But the campaign wasn't as successful as they'd hoped. They'd hoped to get more elected. So again, I try and look at variation. So for example, the most experienced candidate does less well in 2014 than 2010, Wang Zhongming. However, it's two newcomers, Zhou Jiangjie and Wang Haoyu, who are elected. So I call this chapter Unfinished Progress, which suggests that the party is making progress, but it's still not a finished product yet. And here I'm playing on the title of Shou Cailin's documentary about Wang Zhongming, which is a really wonderful, if you want to get a feel of Taiwanese movement parties and social movements, I would really encourage you to take a look at this documentary. Then we move on to the 2016 election. And here the party looks like it should finally make the breakthrough at the national level. It's contesting in alliance with the SDP, and the early opinion polls suggest that it does have a really good chance. However, finally, it only gets 2.5%. So it's an improvement on 2012, 5% threshold. Again, the election is much better funded than 2012, and they get very widespread endorsements. But it's ultimately unsuccessful, and it ends in very bitter recriminations. And again, I look at the changing party system, for example, the emergence of competitive movement parties, such as the New Power Party. But a lot of the problem is within the GPT's own campaign. For example, in its alliance with the SDP, which is handled very, very poorly. Then I move to the next round of local elections in 2018. And the party tries a very different style of campaigning, much more focused on winning and much less focused on ideals. So I talk about the party selling it. I raised a question about whether the party is selling its soul. As one of the things we see here is that a lot of the party's traditional supporters are very uncomfortable with the party's new approach. Taoyuan, a local councillor, Wang Haoyu. So here we see the contrasting views about winning, but also losing touch with the party's core values. Sometimes this also means working together with figures that ideologically are quite distant from the party, such as the MKT, Mingguodang, or the controversial Taipei Mayor, Ko Wen-je. And these are questionable for some of the party idealists. However, it does manage to improve its local performance, winning 4 seats at the local level. And then I come to the final campaign, and that's the 2020 election. And in theory, it looked like we have a return to 1996. Party founder Zhou Jiangjie to his 1996 campaign, but also he's making references to how he tried to recall the KMT's Han Guoyu back in 1994. However, in reality, the focus of this campaign is on the contrasting style of the controversial Wang Haoyu and the psychiatrist Deng Huiwen. However, this means we have a very, very contradictory signals coming out with this very, very negative, aggressive Wang style with the much softer approach of Deng Huiwen. So one of the puzzles we have in this campaign is, why does the party do quite well? In other words, it does just as well as 2016, but it loses a lot of its original supporters, but is able to win a significant number of new supporters. And again, I'm focusing on the campaign, but also on the different party system. As the movement party scene is becoming even more competitive in 2020 compared to 2016. And then in the final concluding chapter, I talk about what happened after the defeat in 2020, how the party tries to rebuild and rebrand. It tries to recover its ties with many social movements that it had become alienated with over the previous couple of years. So, for example, it tries to reconnect with the algal reef protection movement that it had alienated in the previous couple of years. And lastly, I talk about some of the practical lessons. In other words, when I first started the project in 2012, I said that I would try to offer some practical suggestions to how the party could improve its performance. I never did that, and I only finally do that in this concluding chapter. So I talk about some of the things it needs to do in terms of alliances, organizations, and election campaigning. This talk is part of a kind of a global online book tour that has mainly been focused on Taiwan study centers such as Tübingen. But one of the things I'm hoping to do in the future is to engage more with Green Party audiences. And it's something that I'm hoping to do, but I haven't quite managed yet. And I still are looking forward to talking about this book in Taiwan itself. And again, something I haven't done, I would like to do in person. This is me talking in a Green Party event, I think in 2017 or 2018. But as I mentioned earlier, what I'm working on now is a Chinese version of the book. But rather than being a purely translated book, I'm working to have a rewritten book that brings in a range of perspectives. So I have one of the party leaders from the early period, but also a more recent figure, Wang Yanhan, working with me on this project, because I've never managed to publish any of my books in Taiwan in Chinese, and that's one of the things I'm looking forward to doing. And it's quite an interesting process. Co-authoring, I think, is always interesting, but I think I'm hoping that it's going to bring something very, very different to the project. I'm glad to see that you already have the book in the Tübingen library. The book is in hardback edition, but the ebook is a little bit better priced, and it's available on the Routledge, but also on Amazon. But I would encourage you to, if you're not with you, they get a copy, because I think for academic books, I think that's really important. It helps us to get the paperback out earlier. And I think that's where I'm going to finish. And I look forward to hearing your questions. And once people have read the book, I'm really looking forward to hearing your comments on the book. Thanks again, Stefan, and back.